good evening. Welcome back to Dusty Feet. It's August 4th, 2026, and we're continuing our walk through the scroll of First Kings with our Outside the Class series. In our last episode, right, we followed Elijah from the palace of King Ahab to the brook of Cherith. We watched the brook fade, then we walked with Elijah into the foreign land of Sidon. There, at the gate of Zarephath, he met a widow. Remember, she was gathering sticks. So before we step back into that moment, I want us to stop. Be sure to watch the original Bible Project video. Link will be in the description below at TheDustyFeet.com. And it gives us the wider view of the scroll of First Kings. But here, we slow down. We spend time with these people, people who are actually living it. Our hope with the Dusty Feet is to foster discussion and to help build and support communities. If you're not already connected to a community or just want to share and interact, this community has 4 primary ways to interact. 1. DustyFeet.com. That's our primary place for everything. You are always free to comment. 2. Substack. Link is in the description below. Designed around the written and spoken text, it's a place to connect to ourselves and others. 3. Facebook. At Dusty Feet Journey. These videos and other videos are also available for comment and discussion. And as always, 4, you're welcome to send an email to Bob at TheDustyFeet.com. These places, they will be moderated and guidelines will be set to ensure healthy, safe discussion. And of course, before we jump in, a quick reminder, if you find these talks useful, please click subscribe. But if you know someone who may enjoy walking through the scripture this way, please like and share this episode with them. Because along this road, we ask questions. We look at what the text says. We also notice what it does not say. And then we try not to rush past the people, in order just to reach the lesson. Because they do not know how their stories would end. They're living them out one day at a time, just like we are. So when we left the story, right, Elijah had asked the widow for water and bread. The woman told him she had no bread. She only had a small amount of flour, only a little oil. She was gathering sticks so that she could make one final meal for herself and her son. And then she said they would die. We know what happens next, but she does not. So let's stand with her for a moment longer before we scooch ahead. Because she is not a symbol, right? She's not simply a lesson about faith. This is a mother who believes she can no longer feed her child. That's where we're standing, and that is the moment that we're into which Elijah will then speak. Because then he says, do not fear. You know, those words sound simple to us. But fear is not simple, right? When the food's gone, fear is not simple when your child's hungry. Elijah asks her to do something that must have sounded almost impossible, right? He tells her to make a small bread cake for him first. Then she can prepare food for herself and her son. That request, I think it can sound harsh. Why would Elijah ask a hungry mother to feed him before feeding her child? But that request, it's not just a request. It doesn't stand by itself. It comes with a promise. This is where Elijah says, for thus says Yahweh, this is the God of Israel, the bowl of flour shall not be exhausted, nor shall the jar of oil be empty, until the day that Yahweh sends rain on the face of the earth. Now the woman faces a choice. She's a handful of flour, a little oil, a hungry son, the word of a prophet she's just met. Elijah doesn't offer proof. She does not show her a full storehouse, right? He gives her a word from Yahweh. That's all. We're not even told what she thought. We're not told how long she stood there. We do not know whether she even looked at her son. We don't know whether she looked at the flour and the oil one more time, staring at it, right? The text simply says she went and did according to the word of Elijah. That's a small sentence, but I think there's great weight in it. Because she just takes the next step, right? And as she does, the flour, it doesn't run out. The oil, it doesn't fail. There is food for Elijah. There is food for the woman. There is food for her household. Day after day, there's enough, right? Not a full storehouse, not stacks of grain piled against the walls. Enough. I like that word, right? God's care in this chapter often comes in daily form. Daily bread. Bread in the morning. Bread in the evening. Water from a brook, right? Flour in a bowl. Oil in a jar. The gifts are simple. The miracles, simple. Yet they keep those very people alive. But I wonder what those mornings felt like, right? Someone reaches into the bowl. There's flour. Someone fills the jar. There's oil. They eat. Next morning, they do it again. And again, there's enough. The text doesn't tell us exactly how long this went on, right? Only that it continued until the rain returned, right? Perhaps the act of reaching into the bowl never stopped feeling amazing. Or maybe perhaps over time it became part of their daily life. Yeah? We don't know. But we know that God's faithfulness often enters our lives through small gifts that we receive again and again and again. A meal, place to sleep, kind word, another morning, enough strength for one more day. And I think there's another part of this scene that's easy to miss, right? Elijah stays in the widow's home. The chapter doesn't say that he visits, performs a miracle, and then leaves. He lives there. This is a prophet from Israel, a widow from Sidon, and her son, right? Three people who would never have chosen one another, right? They now share a roof and a table. The story doesn't even tell us about their daily talks. Doesn't tell us what the boy thought of Elijah. It doesn't tell us whether Elijah spoke about Israel or told them about this God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Still, one thing's clear. They're no longer strangers passing at a city gate, right? They are now sharing life. And I think the miracle is not only that the flour and the oil remain. I think God is also forming a small and, I will say, unexpected community. But then, without warning, right, everything changes again. The widow's son becomes ill. His sickness, it grows worse. And at last, the text says there's no breath left in him. One sentence changes the whole house. The daily rhythm is broken. The flour's still there. The oil's still there. but the child's gone. That must have been almost impossible to understand. God kept them alive through this famine. So why save the boy from hunger only to have him die to an illness? I don't think the story gives time for the widow to work through that question in a calm way. Her grief, it speaks almost at once, right? She turns to Elijah and says, "What have I to do with you, man of God?" Right? "You have come to me, bringing my wrongdoing to remembrance to put my son to death." Her words are painful. She looks at Elijah. She looks at her past, and she wonders if the death of her son is somehow her fault. Grief often searches for reasons. Did I do this? Did I fail? Is God punishing me? Could I have stopped it? The text doesn't even tell us what sin she has in mind. It doesn't say that her fear is even true. It simply lets us hear her. And I'm grateful that the Bible doesn't clean up her words. She's not giving a careful statement of belief. She is speaking from a broken heart. Grief does not speak in neat lines. But notice Elijah's response. He doesn't interrupt her. He doesn't correct her. He doesn't explain why children suffer. He doesn't tell her to be calm. He says, "Give me your son." There's something very human in those words. Elijah cannot take away her pain with an answer. So he takes the child into his arms. So sometimes the most faithful thing we can offer a person in pain, it's not an explanation. It's just our presence. It's just being there. So Elijah, he carries the boy upstairs to the room where he's been staying. He lies him on the bed. And then for the first time in this chapter, we're allowed to hear Elijah pray. Right? This is when he cries out. He says, "Yahweh, my God, have you also brought disaster to the widow with whom I am staying by causing her son to die?" Listen to the question. Elijah does not understand. The prophet asks, why? This is the same man who stood before Ahab. This is the same man who was fed by ravens. This is the same man who watched flour and oil remain day after day after day. He still has questions. I find that comforting. Because I think we can begin to think that strong faith means never asking why. But that's not the picture that we find in Scripture. Abraham asks questions. Moses asks questions. David cries out. Jeremiah speaks from pain, right? The Psalms are filled with honest words spoken to God. Even Yeshua says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" But questions do not always mean that faith has failed. Sometimes a question is what faith sounds like when the heart is hurting. But Elijah does not turn away from God. He turned toward him, right? He brings the child, he brings the grief, he brings the question into God's presence. Then Elijah stretches himself over the child 3 times, and he calls out, "Yahweh, my God, please let this child's life return to him." No audience, no crowd, right? No contest. Only a quiet room, a grieving prophet, a lifeless child, and God. Elijah does not speak as though he controls what happens next, right? He just asks. He pleads. He depends on Yahweh. And then the text gives us one of the most important lines in the chapter. Yahweh heard the voice of Elijah. The child's life returns. He lives. But notice where the story places the power, right? It's not in Elijah. It's not in a method, right? It's not in the fact that he stretched himself over the child 3 times. Yahweh hears. Yahweh restores life. Elijah's the servant. God's the source, right? This has been true throughout this entire chapter. God sends Elijah. God gives food through ravens. God guides him to Zarephath. God brings the flour and the oil, and they don't fail. God hears the prayer. God gives the boy his life again. Elijah, he's just part of the story. Yahweh's been at the center, well, from the very start. Elijah lifts the boy, carries him downstairs. Imagine that walk, right? Earlier, Elijah had carried up a child with no breath in him. Now, he carries the child down alive. He places the boy into his mother's arms. And then Elijah says simply, "See, your son is alive," right? No long speech, no claim of credit, only a child returned to his mother. Your son's alive. I think sometimes true servants, they quietly point, well, away from themselves. That's when the woman speaks for the final time. Now I know that you are a man of God and that the word of Yahweh in your mouth is truth. What does she mean by now I know? Had she been unsure about Elijah, right? Had she wondered if the flour and the oil would last? Had her view of Yahweh changed? The text doesn't explain. We only know that she has walked through something that's changed her. At the city gate, she spoke of Yahweh, your God. Now she speaks the truth of Yahweh's word. And I think maybe something has taken root in her. You know, I think something has changed in Elijah too, right? This chapter's it's not only about a prophet doing great things. I think it's about a prophet being formed. Elijah learns to trust God beside this fading brook. He enters a land not his own. He receives care from a poor widow and her son. He shares life with her family. He carries a mother's grief. He prays with a question. So before Elijah ever stands on Mount Carmel, God shapes him in hidden places, right? He shapes him at a brook, at a city gate, at a table, in a small upstairs room. I think we often think that Elijah's great moment will come when fire falls from heaven. It'll be a great moment, but perhaps this room in Zarephath, perhaps it matters just as much. There's no nation watching. There's no prophets from Baal nearby. There's only one mother who's lost her son, and that one life now matters. God is not only teaching Elijah how to stand before kings, I think he's teaching him how to carry someone else's sorrow. He's not only preparing Elijah to speak with power, I think he's teaching Elijah how to know him more deeply. So as we leave 1 Kings chapter 17, I don't want to tie every part of a chapter into a neat answer, because some of the parts of the story still remain difficult. Let's be real. The drought was real. People suffered, right? A mother carried pain that words could not fix. The chapter doesn't explain every question that it brings up, right? That it raises up to us. But it does show us people who kept taking the next step. Elijah walks towards Ahab, then toward the brook, then toward Zarephath. The widow, she gathers sticks, then offers water, then makes bread. Elijah, he carries the child, then he prays. No one sees the whole road. Each person just receives the next step. So maybe this week, return to the chapter, read it slowly, and sit beside the brook. Watch the water fade. Walk with Elijah into Sidon, right? Stand near the widow as she gathers sticks. Sit at the table while the flour remains. Listen to a mother speak from grief. Stand quietly outside the room while a prophet asks God questions. But remember, they did not know that they were in the Bible. They were just people trying to trust God one day at a time. So maybe that's why their story can still reach deep into us. Because not only we're not so different, we're not different. We're also walking and not seeing the full road. Just one step at a time. We face days when the brook runs low. We also ask God what God is doing. We live by the next gift, the next word, the next step. Think about that this week. So until next time, keep wandering with dusty feet, because some of the best things we find in Scripture are not found by racing to the end. I think they're found when we slow down and walk beside the people who lived in the stories. Shalom, shalom.